Now, a week ago, I said that Anthony Albanese's leadership was in crisis. Now, in fact, after another week from hell, I think his authority has been smashed for good. Now, the problem is not just that the leadership he's been delivering is the exact opposite of what he promised.
If I'm Prime Minister, I won't go missing when the going gets tough, or pose for photos and then disappear when there's a job to be done. I'll show up, I'll step up, and I'll work every day to bring our country together.
Now, what a joke that was. In fact, since then, the Prime Minister has gone missing very often, thanks to all that travel. He's posed for pictures an awful lot. And then, yes, he has disappeared when there is a job to be done, like the other day, keeping murderers off our street or keeping the cost of living down. And instead of working to bring us together, he's, of course, campaigned to divide us by race with his disastrous voice to Parliament. Now, the thing is, when that voice was defeated, I think something broke. Now, Albanese already seemed distracted by the voice, is still distracted by all the travel, hasn't been able to focus on the basics like cost of living. He has seemed too wowed by the luxuries and the pampering that comes with being Prime Minister. You know those tennis stickers, Australian Open, the Gwen Stefani concert he went to last week with world leaders, the flattery from China.
People were saying that we have a handsome boy coming from Australia.
And now our Prime Minister commands so little respect that he's even asked today, or yesterday, whether he had sex in the White House. And really, he loved it.
When you're staying at the White House with your other half, you've got to,
Christen the room.
You've got to,
what goes on tour stays on tour.
Now, with this leadership vacuum, it seems to me the government is falling to bits. These past 2 weeks, what a disaster. More than 60 criminals and undesirables released from immigration detention with almost no security. 860 Palestinians given temporary visas with minimal checks. China's leader not confronted about an attack on our Navy divers. Now this panic spending on Labor's climate targets. I could go on. Joining me is Cameron Milner. He was Chief of Staff to Bill Shorten when he was the Labor leader before Albanese replaced him, and wrote a devastating column about him in The Australian this week, which I think is a must-read. Thank you for your time. You worked with Anthony Albanese. You know him. Why has his leadership suddenly hit the wall, as it were?
Well, I think this has been coming. I think this is an erosion from the start. There was such promise and such under-delivery. The Prime Minister's been distracted on his Albanese voice, and he's simply been absent from the country. He's not been a Prime Minister dealing with the cost of living, which is the #1 issue for Australians. But is it, I don't quite get it, is it that he sort of got into the Prime Ministership by default and, suddenly we now see him for what he is, that he was given a lot of leeway, people expected much, and now the reality's there. Is it that he's lazy maybe, not on top of detail, or maybe he's just unlucky, I don't know. Well, detail's never been an Albanese thing, so put that to one side. He's not a details man, but he's not lazy. He's not lazy. He has been travelling the world, doing a diplomatic Kentucky tour. As someone said, he's flown to the moon and beyond. So he's been working hard at 40,000 feet. What people want to see, though, is him working hard as the Prime Minister of Australia, dealing with cost of living, which is a crippling pressure on families and businesses alike. But Cameron, obviously international travel is part of a Prime Minister's job. The public may not like it. Good for Australia. I mean, I would question how much travel has been doing, what results has been getting, and sometimes the focus of it. But I also wonder, is it just, well, look, it's been caught out by having to do what's necessary, or is there also an element of, by golly, I'm enjoying this a lot. I'm really famous now, and look at these selfies and all that kind of stuff. What is it?
Well, certainly, travelling the world and being feted at state dinners and summits, having the President of China call you a handsome boy, I'm sure they're all great compliments, and I'm sure he feels very good about himself. But the job of the Prime Minister isn't to be the Minister for Foreign Affairs. It's to be the Prime Minister of Australia and spend more time in our country dealing with the number one issue, which is cost of living.
But I'm trying to work out what's driving him, right? He's made a big pitch about being the boy from Housing Commission flat, single mother, and I thought it was a great... In fact, I recommended when he was running for the leadership that he stick that in his speeches. I said, you've got to make more of it. I didn't realise he'd make this much of it, but anyway, put that to one side. Look, I don't come from a rich family myself, but I do wonder sometimes whether... Coming from that background, Albanese is giving the vibe of a boy that's made good to even his own surprise, and that it's gone to his head, he's giddy with it, and that's why, for instance, the Chinese think that they can flatter him by calling him a handsome boy and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, look, the silver service on Toto 1 at 40,000 feet is probably pretty good from a boy from Housing Commission. But that said, he's had 27 years in Parliament and he's now a rich person. He has multi-million-dollar rental portfolio. He is a long way distant from his time as being a kid in the Housing Commission, and that trapping of office and trapping of wealth is reflecting on his out-of-touchness in terms of what he's trying to deal with in terms of cost of living for everyday Australians.
But what's driving this? I'm still not 100% sure I get what's driving it, because he said he wanted to do cost of living. He said as a boy from the Housing Commission, his heart's with the working class, but it's not translating.
Because cost of living is a hard job. The person who's doing the job for Albanese is Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers is actually every single day doing what he can as Treasurer of Australia, but he's got one hand tied behind his back because the Prime Minister's not at the Prime Ministerial desk. He's at someone else's desk having a state reception or being feted. We need a Prime Minister back in Australia dealing with the number one Australian issue, which is cost of living.
Well, I think he'll be back in Australia a lot more now. I think he's been burnt on the travel. You mentioned Jim Chalmers. What do you think some of his colleagues will be thinking, particularly people with an eye to the leadership themselves? Jim Chalmers, Tony Burke, Tanya Plibersek.
Jim Chalmers, without doubt, has put his name forward for a future Labor leadership. If you're a betting person, he's short-priced favourite to be the next Labor leader because he's doing the work that matters. He's there on the ground dealing with cost of living. And last weekend's Glossy magazine piece was simply the start of that campaign for leadership.
Are you saying, therefore, that the leadership is becoming in play now?
Look, I think there's been enough backroom chats between backbenchers and frontbenchers that I hear around Canberra that people are worried about where the Prime Minister's taking Labor Party. They're worried about his plummeting numbers, and they're worried that Peter Dutton, who is, according to the Albanistas, unelectable, now looks like he's competitive.
But how serious do you think that is? I mean, there's always going to be leadership chatter. Every Prime Minister has to deal with that. Do you think it's going to lead to something? Because I just wonder, I just think, Cameron, for Albanese, it's almost all downhill from here. You've got inflation not coming down as it should. You've got cost of living being a real problem. You've got electricity prices. That promise is not going to be met. I'm just trying to think where the easy wins are for him to actually get himself back in the game. So I just wonder whether this could prove a long slide downhill for him, and maybe even, I don't know, like I say, leadership trouble.
Well, his numbers are falling faster than a downhill skier at the moment in terms of rate of descent. What he needs to do is clear the diary. He should come up to Queensland and walk a shopping centre with Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers talks to people. Chalmers talks to people in his electorate. Albo should go along with Jim Chalmers this weekend at Logan Central and meet people doing it tough and actually hear their pain of the cost of living. 12 interest rate rises from this government already. He should be out there listening to people and hearing their pain in a shopping centre this weekend.
Cameron Milner, hasn't escaped me that you've mentioned Jim Chalmers' name quite often here. So we shall see. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for your time too, Andrew.